The city was alive that night, humming with neon lights and the unrelenting rhythm of New York. Somewhere between the skyscrapers and the rain-slick streets, two people were about to collide, not with force, but with something far more dangerous. Something delicate, inevitable, and irreversible. Love. It began in a bookstore that still smelled faintly of paper and dust, one of the last survivors of a city obsessed with speed. He was there first, Ethan Cole. Tall, a little too neatly dressed for someone browsing second-hand shelves, with the kind of eyes that noticed things others missed. Ethan wasn't looking for a story, he was hiding from one. His past. His regrets. She arrived like a disruption, and that's exactly what she was. Amelia Reyes, bright, chaotic, with laughter that could soften even the hardest moments. She wasn't meant to be in that store, her train had been delayed, the rain had started too suddenly, and she ducked in to escape the storm. It wasn't love at first sight. Not yet. It was something subtler, quieter. The way her fingers brushed past the same book his hand was reaching for. The hesitant glance. The awkward apology. And then, the smile. "Take it," she said softly. "You sure?" Ethan replied. She nodded, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "It doesn't belong to me." "Not yet." That was how it began. They spoke about books at first, and then about everything else. The hours slipped by like pages turning too quickly. She loved music, old records especially, because she believed they carried the ghosts of every room they'd ever played in. He loved architecture, the bones of buildings, the way steel and glass could hold both weight and dreams. She teased him for being too serious, he teased her for being too impulsive. When the rain finally stopped, neither of them wanted to leave. But they did, reluctantly, walking in opposite directions, only to realize later that the world had already shifted. Something had been set in motion. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found excuses to pass that bookstore again, though he never admitted why. Amelia returned too, sometimes with coffee in hand, sometimes with flowers she claimed were for the counter, not you, though Ethan noticed the way her eyes lingered. Their meetings weren't planned, yet they kept happening, like fate had taken a personal interest. The city became their playground. They wandered Central Park at midnight, whispering secrets as though the trees could keep them. They rode the subway just to see where it would take them, laughing when they ended up lost in Queens. They kissed for the first time on the Brooklyn Bridge, the skyline burning behind them, as if the city itself was a witness. But love, the kind that consumes, is never simple. Ethan carried shadows he never spoke of, a failed engagement that left him doubting his worth, a brother lost too young, a heart trained to protect itself. Amelia carried her own battles. A father she hadn't spoken to in years, an illness she didn't always acknowledge, a fear that happiness could vanish overnight. Still, together, they felt invincible. One evening, under the golden lights of Grand Central, Amelia asked him, "Do you believe in forever?" Ethan hesitated, staring at the constellations painted on the ceiling. Finally, he said, "I believe in moments that feel like forever." She smiled, but something in her eyes flickered. "Then let's collect as many as we can." And so they did. They collected stolen mornings, rooftop sunsets, quiet nights when the world outside didn't exist. They carved their names into wet cement by the river, knowing it would be washed away someday, but loving it anyway. They were reckless, they were fragile, they were alive. Yet even as their love grew, so did the weight of silence. There were things unsaid, truths avoided. Ethan never asked why Amelia sometimes clutched her side and winced when she thought he wasn't looking. Amelia never pressed him about the night she found him staring at an unopened letter, tears in his eyes. They existed in a fragile balance, afraid that honesty might shatter what they had. But fate has a cruel way of reminding us that balance is temporary. On a cold December night, snow swirling through the city streets, Ethan and Amelia stood outside the bookstore where it all began. She held his hand, her cheeks flushed from the wind, her breath visible in the air between them. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Promise me, if I disappear one day, you won't forget me. Promise you'll remember us, even if everything else fades." Ethan pulled her close, his voice unsteady. "Don't talk like that. Promise me," she insisted, her eyes searching his as if this was the only thing that mattered. And he promised. What he didn't know then was that she had already begun disappearing, piece by piece, in ways he couldn't yet see. The city kept moving. The lights kept glowing. And their love kept deepening, blind to the storm gathering quietly just beyond the horizon. This was only the beginning. The first snow dissolved into gray slush, and New York shrugged into a colder kind of beauty. The days were shorter, the nights deeper, and their rituals grew cozier to match. They bought cheap candles that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. They learned the language of each other's silences, the way he squeezed her hand twice when crowds felt too loud, the way she leaned her head on his shoulder when the world felt too sharp. In those small translations, they found a home. But homes can be built on fault lines. It started with a tremor so small it almost didn't register. A missed call from a number Amelia hid under the name dentist. A calendar reminder she quickly swiped away while he was making tea. She laughed about it when he asked, teased him for being nosy, and kissed him like distraction could be medicine. And in a way, it was. For a little while. Ethan had his own fault line. An envelope slept on his desk. Beneath a stack of architecture journals, cream-colored, the kind of paper that feels heavier than it looks. A return address stared up at him whenever he paid bills, Cole & Cole, attorneys at law. His father's firm. The letter waited without complaint, like a suitcase left by the door. He told himself it was old business, not urgent, not important. He told himself many things that weren't true. On the night the sky cleared into a glassy frost, they took the train to Coney Island just to watch the ocean breathe. The boardwalk was nearly empty. Their words crystallized in the air and fell between the planks. She slipped her hand into his coat pocket and found a pebble smooth as a thumbnail, a piece of some faraway shore. He said he kept it because it reminded him that pressure could turn anything into something precious. She smiled at that, but the wind made her cough until her eyes watered and she had to bend over, palms on her knees, like the air had grown tight around her ribs. He pretended not to see the panic in her face. She pretended not to see the fear in his. When they got back, the radiator clanked like an old pianist clearing his throat. She collapsed onto the couch, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't cure. He tucked a blanket around her and put on one of her favorite records, the one with the crackle between tracks that she swore sounded like snow falling. He made soup he was proud of, then burned the toast and swore at the smoke alarm like a man defending his honor. She laughed until she cried, or cried until she laughed, the difference was thin as tissue that night. "Do you ever keep secrets?" she asked suddenly, watching steam curl up from her bowl. "Everyone does," he answered, not looking at the desk where the envelope hibernated. "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that mean well," he said, and tried to smile. "The kind you keep because you think you're saving someone." "From what?" "From yourself. From possible futures. From gravity." She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. Then she set the spoon down carefully and asked, "Do you remember what you promised me?" He felt the floor tilt. "I remember. If I disappear." "You're not disappearing." She sighed, not with annoyance, but with the resignation of someone who knows a storm's timetable better than the weatherman. "I'm trying very hard not to." In the morning, he woke to a soft sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. In the bathroom, the mirror had fogged over. She was on the floor, one hand gripping the edge of the tub, the other pressed to her side. Her face had gone the color of paper. He knelt, stupid with fear, and she said a thing so gentle it didn't feel like permission, it felt like surrender. "Help me." Hospitals have a way of shrinking the world into white squares and artificial air. The fluorescent lights made everything look like the truth. They sat across from a doctor with kind eyes and the calm voice of someone who practices both medicine and mercy. Amelia's illness had a name, one she had carried for years like a folded note she never opened. It had been managed, contained, domesticated into routines of pills and checkups, until it wasn't. A flare. Complications. The familiar turned treacherous. Is it bad? Ethan asked, and hated the child in his voice. The doctor didn't answer with words. The chart closed like a book at the end of a chapter you didn't want to reach. Appointments multiplied. Scans layered over scans. The language of their love story absorbed new vocabulary, markers, margins, protocols. The city outside remained itself, horns and hot dog carts and steam rising from manholes, while inside they learned to count time in dosage and rest. She kept working anyway, teaching music to kids who widened their eyes when she explained that songs could hold time the way jars hold fireflies. He kept sketching anyway, lines and light, buildings that lifted instead of blocked. They became greedy for ordinary. A quiet grocery line, a mailbox that squeaked, the first sip of coffee, his thumb finding her pulse and feeling it answer, "I'm here." One afternoon, when the light in their apartment was the color of honey, he finally opened the letter. It was not old business. It was a map of the road he'd been refusing to see. His father was retiring. The firm needed someone to manage the transition. Come home. Lead the practice. A future laid out in legalese and parental hope. He thought about it for an hour, or a week. Time behaved badly that day. He imagined an office with his name on the glass, steady income, a life trimmed neatly along the edges. He imagined leaving the city that had taught him to want more than safety. He imagined leaving her. The thought felt like a betrayal of bone. He put the letter back under the journals and did nothing. Fate, insulted by inaction, made a different move. An email from a design collective in Oslo, of all places, lit up his phone at 2:14 a.m. They had seen his competition entry, the one he'd submitted and promptly dismissed. They wanted him for a winter residency. They would pay well. They would sponsor a visa. His work would stand in a gallery where daylight behaves like a living creature. 3 months abroad. A door swung open so wide the draft lifted the papers on his desk. He didn't tell her. Not because he meant to hide it forever, but because he wanted to pick the right moment, the kind of moment that arranges itself like flowers. He waited for a day without needles, a day without numbers, a day where her laughter landed without stumbling. Days like that were rare. They felt like contraband. When the right moment finally arrived, it betrayed its own name. They were in the bookstore where they met, the owner dozing on a stool, the bell over the door clinging to the end of a ring. She found an old copy of a poetry collection and read lines aloud in a whisper that made the aisles feel sacred. "I got an email," he said, too loud in the hush. She closed the book. "From who?" "From somewhere that wants me." Her face flickered, then steadied. "What did it say?" He told her, each word heavier than the last. At first she brightened with pride, then dimmed with what pride could not touch. She traced the edge of the book with one finger, slow, careful. "You have to go," she said. "I don't have to do anything." "You have to go," she repeated, more firmly, as if instructing a child how to cross a street. "Your life can't be a room that fits only me." He tried to argue, but she lifted a hand and he fell silent. "I don't want to be the reason you don't open a door you've earned. What if I lose you while I'm gone?" Her smile was the bravest thing he had ever seen. "Then you'll know the answer to the question people waste years asking themselves." What question? Was it love? He wanted to say yes, but the word felt too small for everything it needed to carry. He took her hands instead and squeezed twice. She squeezed back. The bell on the door sighed as a breeze slipped in. The owner woke, blinked, and smiled like he had seen this scene before, every day, in 100 different variations. On the walk home, the city sounded like an argument and a lullaby. She leaned on him more than usual. He pretended not to notice. When they reached the stoop, she paused halfway up, breath thin, face pale. "Promise me something else," she whispered. "You're stacking promises like books. Promise me you'll write to me every day. Not texts. Letters. I can't mail from Oslo to Brooklyn in a day." "Then write them anyway," she said. "Even if they arrive late. Even if they arrive after." "After what?" She looked past him, as if the horizon had a subtitle only she could read. "After." He wanted to refuse the whole vocabulary of after. But he nodded, because some requests are prayers wearing ordinary clothes. That night, while she slept, he drafted his acceptance email, then deleted it, then drafted it again. He clicked send with his heart in his throat and his breath held like a hostage. 3 months. A winter on the other side of the ocean. A chance big enough to change the shape of a life. He told himself that leaving could be an act of faith. He told himself that love could hold across cold and sky. He told himself he could keep every promise he made. The city listened without comment, ancient and unimpressed. Somewhere far uptown, a train dove into a tunnel and came back out in daylight. Somewhere downtown, a street musician warmed his fingers and began to play. In their small apartment, a record turned, whispering snow between songs. The door had opened. And something, already, had begun to close. The airport felt like betrayal dressed in fluorescent light. Amelia walked with him as far as security would allow, her coat too thin for the January air. She looked small there, standing among the tide of strangers, clutching the poetry book he had given her as if it were armor. Ethan wanted to memorize her face in that moment, but memory is a clumsy artist, it always smudges the lines you need the most. She kissed him once, quickly, like punctuation. "Right," she reminded, her breath warm against his cheek. "Every day." And then she let go. The plane carried him away from her like a secret torn from its envelope. He pressed his forehead against the window and watched the city shrink, light scattering like stars across the dark water, until it all disappeared under clouds. Oslo greeted him with a silence New York had never allowed. Snow lay in perfect sheets, untouched, as if the city had been folded from paper. The collective housed him in a studio apartment overlooking a river that refused to freeze, no matter how the world around it surrendered to winter. They gave him a drafting table, clean paper, and the freedom to dream without apology. And dream he did. His buildings rose on the page like prayers made visible. Designs that breathed, that bent toward light, that lifted instead of weighed down. Critics called his early sketches audacious, as though ambition were a crime. He felt alive in his work, more than he ever had. But each night, he wrote. Letters piled up, sometimes short, sometimes sprawling, describing the way the river shimmered like mercury at dawn, or how Norwegians drank coffee as though it were blood in their veins. He told her about the gallery director who insisted his drawings were songs made solid, about the snowfall that erased the city's edges until it looked infinite. What he didn't tell her was that every beauty felt borrowed. That every triumph tasted hollow because she wasn't there to taste it too. Her letters came late, but they came. She wrote about the bookstore cat who had adopted her lap as its throne. About the children she taught who sang off-key but with so much joy it broke her heart. She wrote about the cold, about how it seeped deeper this year, though she never said why. And always, she ended the same, don't stop. Keep building. Keep loving me from wherever you are. For a while, it was enough. But time is a predator that waits patiently. The first sign arrived in ink. Her handwriting trembled where it once danced. A smudge blurred an entire sentence, as though her hand had given out mid-thought. She apologized for it, but apologies are thin veils. Ethan stared at the letters until his vision blurred, then pressed his forehead to the paper as if closeness could undo distance. Then the phone call came. It was midnight in Oslo when his cell vibrated on the nightstand. An unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer. "Ethan Cole?" a voice asked. "Yes. This is Dr. Lin. Amelia listed you as her emergency contact." The world narrowed. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed, his chest collapsing inward. The doctor explained in measured tones, words Ethan couldn't string together properly: complication, hospitalization, critical. He booked the first flight back, his hands shaking so violently at the ticket counter that the agent asked if he needed medical attention himself. He told her no, but the truth was yes, only the medicine he needed was 3,000 miles away, lying in a hospital bed. The flight was endless. He watched the Atlantic unfurl beneath him, black and merciless, as though daring him to make it across in time. His reflection in the window looked older, friendlier, a man dragged forward by guilt. New York met him with a storm. Rain slapped the taxi windshield as he pressed the driver for more speed, more urgency. The hospital lights glared like judgment when he finally stumbled inside. She was there. Smaller, paler, tubes tracing maps across her skin. Machines marked time in beeps that felt like stolen heartbeats. But when she turned her head, when her eyes found his, something fragile but fierce lit up inside her. "You came," she whispered, voice rough but steady. "I'll always come," he said, taking her hand, though he hated how light it felt in his. She tried to smile. "Even from Oslo?" "Especially from Oslo." For days he didn't leave her side. He read to her from the poetry book until the words became his prayers. He pressed his lips to her temple when she slept, memorizing the rhythm of her breathing. He made the hospital chair his home, his drafts untouched, his career put on pause as though time itself should wait its turn. But time doesn't wait. Doctors spoke in euphemisms. Progressing condition. Limited options. Focus on comfort. Each phrase was a brick in a wall Ethan couldn't scale. He argued, begged, demanded second opinions. Amelia watched him with love and with sadness, her hand stroking his even as her strength faltered. One night, when the machines hummed like lullabies, she said, "Do you regret going?" He froze. "Don't ask me that. I need to know." He looked at her, at the fragile fighter tethered to wires, and shook his head. "I regret leaving. Not going. Leaving." She squeezed his hand, the pressure faint but certain. "Good. Because I didn't want to be your excuse. I wanted to be your reason." Tears blurred the edges of the room. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering, "You are." In the days that followed, she seemed to fade and flare in turns, one moment radiant with laughter, teasing him about his terrible hospital coffee, the next moment slipping under waves of exhaustion so heavy he feared she might not surface again. And then came the night when she asked him to climb into the narrow bed beside her. He hesitated, afraid of breaking something, but she pulled him close until their foreheads touched, until his heartbeat tried to synchronize with hers. "Promise me again," she murmured. "What?" "That you won't forget. That you'll build things that last longer than us." "I don't want things that last longer than us." She smiled weakly. "That's how I know you'll keep the promise." He stayed awake all night, listening to the shallow tide of her breath. Outside, the city never stopped moving. Cars. Sirens. The clatter of life. But in that room, time slowed to a fragile hush. When dawn came, she stirred, opening her eyes with an effort that looked like war. "Read to me," she whispered. He reached for the poetry book and read aloud, his voice cracking on every line. And as the sun broke through the storm outside, casting a narrow beam of gold across the bed, she closed her eyes and whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "Forever." He held her hand tighter, but her grip didn't answer. The machines continued their rhythm, indifferent, clinical. The city outside lit up for another day, unaware that in one small room, a universe had just ended. And Ethan, with her still hand in his, realized that promises are both anchors and knives. Grief, when it comes, does not knock politely. It bursts in, rearranging the furniture of a life, leaving nothing where it belongs. Ethan wandered through the days like a man wearing someone else's skin. The world outside demanded business as usual. Subway doors slamming, vendors hawking pretzels, traffic lights cycling like nothing had changed, but inside, every sound felt like an insult. The funeral was small. Amelia had requested that. Just close friends, her students, a few family members who stood stiffly at the back, their guilt heavy as their silence. Ethan stood near the front, clutching the poetry book as if it were scripture. He didn't speak when invited to. Words betrayed him. All he managed was a nod, his jaw locked against the ocean swelling inside. When the service ended, people touched his shoulder, offered platitudes dressed as condolences. She's in a better place. At least she's not suffering. You were lucky to have her. He hated every sentence. She wasn't a lesson in gratitude, she was flesh, laughter, chaos, light. And now she was gone. That night, back in their apartment, Ethan lit every candle they had, dozens of small flames trembling against the dark. He placed the record she loved on the turntable, and the crackle filled the room like static ghosts. He lay on the couch with her scarf wrapped around his wrist, inhaling a scent that was already fading. Then he began to write. Not letters to her, he had kept that promise already, a stack of envelopes bundled by twine. These were letters he would never send, confessions that spilled out in the ink of sleepless nights. He wrote about the hollow chair at the kitchen table, about how coffee had lost its taste, about how he couldn't sketch a single line without her laughter to balance its weight. He wrote until the pages blurred, until the words blurred, until his grief was ink on paper because it was too heavy to carry alone. Weeks blurred into months. The Oslo Collective sent messages, exhibitions scheduled, opportunities waiting, critics asking. He ignored them all. The architecture journals piled up unopened. He shrank the world down to her absence, living in the shadow of what had been. And then came the envelope. It arrived one rain-soaked afternoon. Slipped under the door by a courier who didn't linger. Ethan opened it without thought, expecting another bill, another reminder of the life he was refusing to participate in. But inside was Amelia's handwriting, her curves and loops unmistakable. The letter was dated 2 weeks before she passed. My love, it began, if you're reading this, I've already gone where I can't follow your footsteps anymore. Don't be angry, I wrote it because I knew you'd collapse under silence. You've always been so strong for me, but strength has edges, and I don't want you cut by them. He read until the tears blurred everything. She told him to live, to travel, to build, to forgive himself for surviving. She reminded him of their night on the Brooklyn Bridge, when the skyline burned and they promised themselves to the world. Keep that promise, she wrote. Love me by living bigger than grief. He folded the letter carefully, pressing his lips to the paper as though it were skin. The next morning, he pulled out the sketches he had abandoned. At first his hands shook. The lines wavered, but slowly steadied. The buildings returned, but now they looked different. Softer. They curved toward the sky like arms reaching. They carried her laughter in their shapes, her voice in their echoes. He worked until dawn, and for the first time since her death, exhaustion felt like relief rather than defeat. But grief does not release easily. He returned to the bookstore, half expecting to see her turning a corner, her curls catching the light. The owner gave him a quiet nod, saying nothing, just sliding across the counter a slim volume of new poems. Tucked inside was a note Amelia had left months earlier, for Ethan, when he comes back alone. Tell him I knew he would. The message gutted him, yet it also stitched something fragile inside. She had known. She had prepared. Love, it seemed, could plant seeds that bloomed even in ruin. Ethan began to rebuild himself in fragments. He started walking the city again, sketchbook in hand, tracing buildings the way others traced memories. He taught part-time at a community center, showing kids how structures could be more than walls, how they could carry meaning. He even laughed once, genuinely, when a student asked if skyscrapers were just trees made of glass. But always, she was there. In shadows, in echoes, in the weightless seconds before sleep. And then came the twist he never expected. One morning, rifling through Amelia's old things, he found another envelope, tucked in the lining of her record sleeve. Inside was a photograph, creased but clear. Amelia, younger, holding the hand of a child no more than 5. A little girl with wide eyes and Amelia's unmistakable curls. On the back, scrawled in hurried ink, for someday. Her name is Clara. Ethan froze, the air in the room thinning. A daughter. Amelia had a daughter. A piece of her alive somewhere, breathing, laughing, perhaps grieving too. Questions attacked him. Why hadn't she told him? Where was Clara now? Was she safe? Did she know her mother was gone? The discovery shattered the fragile scaffolding of his recovery. He pressed the photo to his chest, torn between betrayal and awe. Amelia hadn't trusted him with this truth, or maybe she had wanted to protect them both. But one thing was undeniable, a piece of her still walked the earth. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the desk with the photo propped against the lamp, staring until dawn. And as the first light touched the city, he whispered a vow into the silence. I will find her. The grief that had hollowed him now lit a spark. A mission, a purpose. It was no longer just about surviving her absence. It was about finding the living proof of her love. The next chapter of his life was no longer about building structures of steel and glass. It was about building a bridge to the one person Amelia had left behind. And in that vow, for the first time since her death, Ethan felt something stir inside him. Not hope exactly, but something dangerously close. Because grief had given him ashes. But Clara could be fire. Ethan had never been a man of faith, but in the weeks after finding the photograph, he prayed to something he didn't name. Every night he spread Amelia's letters across the desk, the photograph of Clara at the center, as though the paper might arrange itself into answers. The search began clumsy, emails to old friends of Amelia's, calls to family members who answered with silence or clipped tones. Some claimed ignorance, others refused to talk at all. It was as if Clara were a ghost Amelia had chosen to keep hidden, a shadow even those closest pretended not to see. But grief sharpens into determination when given a direction. Ethan hired a private investigator, sold half his furniture to pay for it, and walked the city each day with his sketchbook, half hoping Clara might step out of the crowd by accident. He imagined her older now, 12, maybe 13. With Amelia's smile, Amelia's curiosity, Amelia's fire. One rainy afternoon, the investigator handed him an address scrawled on a scrap of paper. Queens. A foster home. Ethan's heart rattled in his chest as he stood outside the small brick building, clutching the photo like a passport. Through the window he saw children weaving between worn furniture, their laughter stitched with exhaustion. And then, her. A girl with wild curls tumbling down her shoulders, balancing on a chair with stubborn grace. Clara. He couldn't breathe. The resemblance was undeniable, not just in the hair but in the defiance in her eyes, the same spark that had lived in Amelia. But how do you walk into a stranger's life and declare yourself the keeper of their mother's ghost? He froze on the stoop until rain soaked him through. In the end, he didn't knock. He left, heart heavier than before. Still, he returned. Again and again. Watching from across the street, always from a distance, sketching her in notebooks filled with lines of love and regret. She laughed with friends, argued with caretakers, played hopscotch on cracked pavement. Alive. Brilliant. His proof that Amelia had not vanished entirely. One evening, as he lingered too long, a social worker noticed him. "Sir. Do you need something?" The suspicion in her voice cut deep. Ethan stumbled through an excuse, retreating like a thief. He realized then that love, when twisted by grief, can look like obsession. He went home that night and tore through Amelia's things again, desperate for guidance. That was when he found it, a final letter, hidden beneath the lining of the poetry book's cover. His hands shook as he unfolded it. "My Ethan," it began, "I imagine by now you've found Clara's photo. I need you to understand why I kept her from you. She was born when I was barely more than a child myself. Her father left before she could walk. I gave her to my aunt to raise because I couldn't give her what she deserved. When you and I found each other, I wanted a life that wasn't defined by my failures. You gave me that. Please don't hate me for keeping her apart from us. Please know it was not shame but love. I didn't want her to lose me twice. If one day you choose to find her, tell her I never stopped loving her. And tell her about us. Tell her what love feels like when it's true." Ethan pressed the letter to his chest, his sobs breaking the silence like glass. He finally understood. Amelia hadn't hidden Clara out of mistrust, she had done it to spare them both the pain she foresaw. And yet, in doing so, she had left Ethan with a map to a love unfinished. The next day he returned to Queens, heart pounding, but this time he was noticed again. Clara herself spotted him from the porch. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Why do you keep staring?" she called out, voice sharp but curious. He froze, soaked in guilt and longing. For a moment he considered walking away forever. But then he stepped forward, slowly, and pulled the photograph from his coat pocket. "This was your mother," he said softly. The girl's expression faltered. She stepped closer, hesitant. "You knew her?" Ethan's throat tightened. "I loved her. More than anything." Clara studied him, suspicion and hunger warring in her eyes. Finally, she whispered, "Tell me about her." And so he did. They sat on the stoop as the street lamps flickered awake, and Ethan spoke until his voice cracked. He told her about the bookstore, the bridge, the laughter that could cure the darkest nights. Clara listened, silent but intent, clutching the photograph as if it were oxygen. In that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't since Amelia died, the fragile pulse of purpose. He thought perhaps this was how grief heals, not by forgetting, but by passing love forward. But fate is cruel, and cruelty loves timing. The weeks that followed seemed almost merciful. He visited Clara often, with the cautious permission of her caretakers. He brought books, stories, sketches of buildings that curved toward the sky. She asked endless questions about her mother, hungry to stitch together the fragments. For the first time since Amelia's death, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a life not defined by absence, but by continuity. Until the accident. It was a Tuesday, gray and ordinary. Clara was walking home from school, earbuds in, hood pulled up. A driver, distracted by his phone, never saw her step into the crosswalk. The call came to Ethan, because by then his number was listed with the foster home. He raced to the hospital, the same sterile halls where he had lost Amelia. And there, under the cold glare of machines, lay Clara. Alive, but broken. He begged the doctors for miracles. He clutched her hand the way he had clutched Amelia's, whispering promises he couldn't keep. But hours stretched into days, and her body, too fragile to endure, surrendered. Ethan collapsed in the hallway, grief consuming him for the second time. He had lost Amelia. Now he had lost the last living fragment of her. At the funeral, smaller than Amelia's, he placed the poetry book in Clara's casket. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the two of them, mother and daughter, bound in silence and love. That night, back in the apartment, Ethan lit the last candle, the wick stubbornly flickering. He spread Amelia's and Clara's photos side by side on the desk. He picked up his pen, but no words came. His hand hovered, empty, as though language itself had abandoned him. Finally, he whispered into the dark, "I promised I wouldn't forget. But remembering is killing me." The city outside pulsed with indifferent life, horns, sirens, laughter. But within those walls, a man sat between two absences, drowning in a love story too heavy for one heart. And as dawn crept through the blinds, Ethan understood the cruelest truth of all. Love had not saved him. It had broken him, beautifully, completely, irreversibly. Thank you for watching the Quill's journey. If you're enjoying the atmosphere, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what stood out to you.